Welcome to Animals to the Max. I'm your host, Corbin Maxey. This show is about animals and the people who dedicate their lives to them. And welcome everybody to another episode of Animals to the Max. What's up everybody? This is Corbin Maxey. As always, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for listening to the show. Okay, I am not going to lie. I am so excited about this episode. And, you know, I love podcasts, of course. I love doing this. I love all my episodes. But this interview was so much fun because for me, and I'm sure this resonates with a lot of you listening, I've always been fascinated with the unknown, the unexplained. And honestly, as a kid growing up, I was so fascinated with Bigfoot. I grew up in Roby Creek, Idaho. So it's a really, really small community, about 45 minutes outside of Boise, but just imagine in the middle of the woods. Like I grew up in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and I remember for fun, I would just hike the mountains, just hike on trails, I'd build forts by myself, but I always was wondering, oh my gosh, is there anybody out there? And so I've always been fascinated with Bigfoot, and a lot of you are as well, and so I was so excited for the show to bring on one of the world's leading authorities on Sasquatch, okay? His name is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Now, he's a scientist. He's a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. So, for all my skeptics out there who are thinking, oh, Corbin, great, you brought on some wacko to talk about Sasquatch. That is not the case. This is a very, very credible guy. Matter of fact, he even risked his career. His career was on the line because of him standing up, making a stance, looking at the evidence and saying, hey, there is something out there that is unexplained, and anyway, it is so interesting. So for all of you who believe in Bigfoot, this is great. For all of you who don't, this is great as well because, you know, a lot of you might be on the fence, but this guy, he backs up his claims with evidence. You're going to hear in the interview, he really, was fully 100% sure that this is a real animal when he came across some fresh tracks in Washington when he was 38 years old. And from then on, he has just been set. And like I said, it was so much fun talking to this guy. And please listen with an open mind. Remember that he is very skeptical too. Very, very skeptical, and you should be as a scientist. So, you're going to really enjoy this interview. I do want to point out, there are a few things that he does reference, and if you're not familiar with Bigfoot, I just want to tell you, just, kind of beforehand to get you on the same page. He does mention in the beginning of the video, you'll hear him talk about Patterson and the Gimlin film. And that, for those of you who do not know, is the 1967 film of Bigfoot. And you probably have seen this. If you haven't, go on YouTube, just, type in Bigfoot film or Patterson Gimlin Bigfoot film, and you'll be able to find it. I'll also put it in the show notes, but that is what he is referring to. And in his opinion, that 1967 film is a full proof of a female Bigfoot that they have nicknamed Patty. So just to kind of fill you in there. But before I go to the interview, which I know you guys are going to enjoy, if you haven't, please make sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes. Also, please leave us a 5-star rating. Come on, you guys, you can do it. On iTunes or Spotify or where else are we? SoundCloud, Google Play, wherever you listen to the show, please leave a rating because it really helps me out, and we love all the feedback. So definitely do that. Also, make sure, if you haven't already, you should follow me on my social channels on Instagram at Corbin Maxey, CorbinMaxey, or on Facebook or Twitter. So you can find more information about that. With that said, everybody, I hope you enjoy my interview with the legend himself, Dr. Jeff Meldrum. How's it going?
It's good.
Good. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'll tell you what, I was like, it was kind of a shot in the dark, and I was like, man, I wonder if this guy would do it. But then I saw you're a fellow Idahoan, and I thought, I think I have this in the bag.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That sealed the deal.
Yeah,
sure.
Right there. So let me introduce you. So Dr. Jeff Meldrum, how would you like me to call you?
Jeff is fine.
Jeff is fine? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I have so many questions to ask you, and I've been leading up to this on my social channels. I've been asking people if they had questions for you, and it has blown up.
Oh, I'll imagine. Yeah, I can well imagine, yeah.
Yeah. So where do we begin? Did you ever see yourself being an expert in this field?
Well, no, not necessarily. You have to go back, I guess, the turning point for me was clear back when I was a young guy of about, it was fifth grade, so about 11 years old, I guess, 10 or 11. And Roger Patterson came through Spokane, Washington, where I was living, and that was the premiere showing of his documentary showcasing the 60-second clip. And so I saw the advertisement. The kids at school were talking about it, and I ran home that afternoon, and convinced my dad that we had to go see this. And so he and I and my brother, my younger brother, all three went. Got there early so we could sit around the front. We were on about the third row, I think, and made a huge impression. I mean, I started reading. I read Patterson's book. It turned out our librarian, which was an interesting story in itself, was John Green's niece. So she had his recently published book, On the Track of the Sasquatch, which I referred to heavily the following year when I did my class report on Bigfoot. We're doing a unit on primates. And she had a clippings folder with all these newspaper and magazine clippings that she'd accumulated through the years. And so it was a great introduction. And then, of course, I found Ivan Sanderson's book, which had come out in 1961. And I just devoured that voraciously. That's how I learned geography, was learning all these mountain ranges and the different continents and all the different relic hominoids that existed around the world. And so that interest waxed and waned over the years. But eventually, due to whatever influence that had, I'm sure there was overt or subliminal influence on the directions, or it just brought into focus, I guess, my interests. But I ended up pursuing a career in anatomy with an emphasis in physical anthropology. It was physical anthropology that drew me primarily. But at that time, anatomists were, anthropologists, the market was pretty saturated in academia. Mm-hmm. And programs were popping up with anatomy programs with an emphasis in physical anthropology, and these anthropologists were teaching human gross anatomy in the health professions programs, the medical schools, and allied health, occupational and physical therapy, and that's what I do now. But my interest, my research focus as a comparative anatomist and physical anthropologist has been locomotion, the adaptations of animals for movement, especially humans, and human adaptations to bipedalism. So it's been the lower extremity that really has caught my attention, and adaptations of the foot to the behaviors of walking on 2 feet exclusively. So I was in a perfect position where after this lull, this period of just kind of occasional sporadic and passing interest, I was brought up face to face with a long line of very fresh tracks in southeastern Washington. And the hook was set. I mean, here were tracks that were unmistakable. There was no river.
How old were you, Jeff, when you came across your first set of tracks?
Well, let's see, 1996. So I have to do some fast math here. That's 38.
38.
8. Yeah, that right? Yeah, 38.
And were you?
So I was well into my career. I did not have tenure. That's another story in itself. That it nearly cost me my position.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and the stories, similar experiences by other academics. Dr. Grover Krantz, was passed over for promotion repeatedly because of his preoccupation with this. I had similar experiences as well, but so placing it in the context of my career, I kind of dove into the deep end head first with a bit of naivete and idealism about science and about the community of science. There's a difference. Mm-hmm. There's the practice of science, the ideals of science, the scientific methodology, and then there is the community of scientists and all the politics and paradigms and preconceptions that go with the foibles of imperfect people. And so it was a real eye-opener. I mean, it's been a real educational process about human nature as well as Sasquatch along the road. So
yeah, I just can't. Okay, so you were out actively looking for Sasquatch, and really, really quick, I am an amateur. Do you cringe when people say Bigfoot? Is that not the right term? Do you prefer Sasquatch?
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. I just I've tended to go with Sasquatch because, over the years, Bigfoot has become such a tabloid-ridden and stigmatized name and label. Sasquatch at least shows deference to the Native American traditions that go far beyond, European American experiences with this creature and this species. And even that has been sensationalized to the point. The word I like to use now, because it is a broader question, and it places it, I think, in the context of anthropology and paleontology, and that's relic hominoids. We have these populations, these species of hominoids, be they cousins of the ape family or members of the hominin family, early offshoots, or even some recent ones. I mean, the case for the Russian almas suggests strongly the possibility of relic persistent enclaves of Neanderthals, or maybe Denisovans, something of that Neanderthaloid grade of evolution. So that's pretty interesting. Sasquatch is either, one model is Gigantopithecus extant, having expanded its range from East Asia into North America at some point in the past, or another possibility is, given the remarkable adaptations for bipedalism that exhibits, and I should point out, evolution is very, what's the word? Ingenious and conservative in solving similar problems with similar solutions, and because of the constraints of physics and so forth and biology. And so convergence is a very common one. A common principle in evolution. So just because Bigfoot seems to walk on two legs doesn't mean that it has to share that adaptation with us in a way that suggests a recent common ancestor. A descendant of Gigantopithecus could have evolved bipedalism in a convergent fashion under similar biomechanical conditions, even perhaps more so constrained by a large body-sized ape with the shoulder, wrist, and elbows that don't tolerate compressive forces in quadrupedalism nearly as well. Anyway, I don't mean to wax too technical on the aspects there, but Paranthropus, for example, is another possible early hominin that would be a good model if it became gigantic, along with other Pleistocene mammals, fauna, and expanded its range into Asia and up through the Bering Straits land bridge into North America, as did so many other mammals during that period.
For some people who aren't, scientists, maybe, who are kind of wondering, wait, Giganta who? So
well, we know that this giant ape, Gigantopithecus, that if it stood upright and had limb proportions that were anything similar to our own, it would have been probably 8 to 10 feet tall and weighed in excess of 1,000 pounds, potentially. Somewhere in that range, 600 to 1,000 pounds. And there's arguments, and I quibble on that only because people argue about correlations between body mass and tooth size. When you get up into the extremes of those relationships, it becomes a little less tight of a correlation. But the point being, we have a fossil record of that species that extends up to about 300,000 years ago.
Wow.
So anytime, that species existed for 1.5 million years in East Asia. So there were periods of time. Most attention has been devoted to the Bering Land Bridge, to times that would correlate with possible human incursion. And as you point out, that's, way up in that last couple of tens of thousands of years. But the ocean levels have risen and fallen numerous times, even clear back into the Pliocene and even earlier, perhaps. And there's ample evidence. They've done cores of the continental shelf in that Bering Sea that indicate periods. Then they find pollen of forests in soils. And so there were times when that was exposed and there was contiguous coniferous and sometimes even mixed coniferous broadleaf forests extending all the way from southern China into, the temperate latitudes of southern China into North America. And it's during those times that its range might have expanded and brought it into North America. As I said, as so many other mammals, people sometimes don't realize 75% of the mammals that are native to North America actually have their origins in Asia. And it's just there's been a constant back and forth of species between the two. But I like to point out, for example, the cute little ring-tailed panda, the red panda.
Oh, yeah, yep.
Looks like a little raccoon, kind of. Fossil teeth of that species have been found in Washington State and even in the southeastern United States, like Alabama. Now, if a little animal like that, a forest animal like that, made its way into North America, then there's no reason that a temperately adapted bipedal giant hominoid couldn't have made its way over here as well. There was a book published not too long ago, a very skeptical book, and I had to laugh when I came to this paragraph where he asked the readers then to imagine if he said, if we're to accept the suggestion that Gigantopithecus got over here as the advocates would have you, then you have to imagine this band, this reproductive band of shuffling giant primates braving this frozen Arctic wasteland to make their way into North America, a continent already occupied by hungry hunters, It's just the scenario, the way it's set up is just so ridiculous. That's not it at all. Instead, picture this boreal forest that extends all the way through, and the animals are just naturally expanding their range. There's no migration per se. They don't have some goal where they see a new habitat across the eastern horizon. It's just that there's opportunities for them all along the way as they expand their range generation after generation. Very natural.
So let's go back. So in the late 90s, you stumble across, and I'm assuming you were out searching for Sasquatch, correct?
No, well, not exactly. No, it was kind of a lark. It was actually Boise visiting family, and was telling them about just a recent sort of bump in with Sasquatch or Bigfoot that I'd been asked to evaluate a piece of video footage. But anyway, I turned to my brother, and I said, Pullman is just a few hours drive from here. I've always wanted to go visit Grover's lab, but never have done it.
Yeah,
let's do it. Let's take a trip, you and I, and while the wives go off with the credit cards, we'll take a little road trip. And so we did. And Grover was very gracious, invited us into his lab, and he showed us the casts and everything. And it was just amazing. He even sent me home with a couple of replicas. And on our way back, then we made a detour because of weather to stay on the freeway instead of the secondary roads. We went down through Walla Walla. The Idaho only has, maybe one freeway across the southern half, as you know. And up there through McCall, that was given the time of year, it was in February. The roads were a bit dicey. Anyway, we made a surprise visit to one of these figures involved in and featured in a book that I had been asked to write a review of. Paul Freeman, Wes Summerlin, Bill Lowry. These were fellows that were investigating Bigfoot over a decade period or more in the Walla Walla area of southeastern Washington. And it was because of that I was visiting Paul Freeman, who had a bit of a Midas touch in some people's mind, finding footprints or documenting footprints over the previous decade. It was just he became a bit of a lightning rod, and so had access to a lot of reports. And the tracking conditions in southeastern Washington are amazing because there's such a high content of this glacial loess that we find through western and southeastern Washington and on through Idaho, especially. That dust that blows all across the Snake River Plain. It's that glacial that glacial silt, from the ice ages, and it makes great tracking beds if the roads, as many are there in the Blue Mountains in southeastern Washington, are just gravel or dirt roads without gravel improvement. I'm looking at his casts and just saying, pointing these different features out, amazed. There's something about seeing the original cast in your hand and be able to heft it and look at it and really appreciate the anatomical details. And I was asking all kinds of questions. He says to me suddenly, well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see some fresh tracks?
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. That was my reaction. My jaw went slack. My eyes got big. What do you mean? Oh, I found some just this morning before you arrived. Our visit was completely unannounced. It was just totally, we just decided to go, west instead of east on the highway and take that alternate route, and stopped and caught him at home just as he was driving into his driveway. Well, he'd been up running the dirt roads on that weekend looking for tracks as the snow melted back up into the stations. So as soon as the roads were exposed and they were drivable, he'd start driving them and look for tracks. And I turned to my brother and I said, well, yeah, what have we got to lose? So anyway, so the rest is kind of history. It was this long line of tracks, 35, 45, absolutely clear tracks in the mud. And like I said, there was no mistaking. There was no misinterpretation. They were either hoaxed or they were the real deal. And the anatomical details were so compelling.
And so there was nothing in the back of your mind thinking, man, do you think Paul's messing with me right now? I mean, because if he's like, hey, there's some tracks, you want to come see them, like.
Oh yeah, no, we were thinking that the whole time.
Really?
The whole time, even as we're driving up there, I'm thinking this. Even as I was sitting here looking at the tracks, I'm thinking to myself, how did he do this? Because it wasn't, if you've ever seen a line of tracks left by artificial stompers, it's like having a little rubber stamp on the paper and you just dunk, dunk, dunk. Mm-hmm. You have this line of identical tracks. These showed so much variation in the way they interacted with the soil, the tension cracks and pressure ridges, slide-ins, toe drag-outs, toes flexed, toes extended, toes split. Oh, yeah, pressure ridges. That what really grabbed me was there were some that had this very distinctive mid-tarsal pressure ridge, which at the time, I hadn't thought about, but I was familiar with similar features or similar anatomy, rather, of the foot documented in chimpanzees, what was called the mid-tarsal break by Hicks back, decades ago, when he was observing the way chimpanzees walked and their lack of a stable arch, but yet the retention of a great deal of mobility in the midfoot, which was an adaptation for grass climbing up vertical or inclined supports. It allows you to hold on while the heel still can pivot as a lever. So we've abandoned that in favor of reducing the mobility of those joints so that they screw into a locked position and provide a stable platform. Mm-hmm. So the whole foot acts as a lever, and we get much more efficiency from the plantar flexors at the ankle, the Achilles, mm-hmm. the gastroc and soleus, the triceps surae muscles, and through the Achilles tendon. And so, all these features, I'm kind of pinching myself thinking, is this the real deal? Could this really be the real deal? And at one instant, as I've said before, even talking about it now, I can still have that same sensation where the hair stands up on my neck because, my gosh, there actually was a Sasquatch that walked by here last night.
Oh, I'm getting chills thinking about it. But how long did it take you? Okay, so first you show up, you see the tracks, you're a little skeptical. How long does it take you to be like, holy crap, man, this is real?
15 minutes.
Okay.
To look at them, and I was taking pictures. I was so taken aback. I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but was so taken aback. I had a video camera in case behind the bench seat of my brother's pickup truck that we were driving in, mm-hmm. and I totally forgot about it. I took dozens of pictures, but I didn't get the video camera to video document this whole scene. I did do some measuring and so forth. We had scale. I had a paint stir stick that we went after we dropped Paul off back home. He was downplaying the whole thing the whole time.
Well, really?
These aren't very good. Well, yeah, he said these aren't very good. He collected so many tracks that he didn't bother with them unless he thought they were, perfect. And in my estimation, what he was describing as imperfections were all the telltale signs of authentic animate footprints, of a real being. And so I was just amazed at it. And we took him home. It was on a Sunday afternoon, so we had to drive all over in Walla Walla to find a hardware store. I turned to my brother and I said, even if these are hoaxed, what an opportunity to document the anatomy of a hoax.
Yeah.
And if real, we can't walk away from this. So we went and found a hardware store open, got a couple of buckets and some plaster and some stir.
Oh my God.
Went back up there and really started looking at the evidence and sort of laying out what had happened. And as it turned out, Paul had read the thing absolutely 180 degrees backwards, and which made a couple of basically what it looked like. We pulled in with the truck, and the track started. They appeared to make kind of a hairpin loop and then came back and stopped where the truck was. I thought, well, that's awfully suspicious.
Yeah.
You're just in the back of your truck, don your fake feet, you jump into the mud, you run out, make a loop, and you dive in the back, kick off the muddy boots, climb into your cab, and off you go. So I said, anyway, I don't know if we want to belabor this one point so long, but we really dissected that. I mean, we kind of forensically reconstructed what had to have happened for this to have made sense if it was real. If it was real, there has to be sign beyond this point where the truck is parked.
Of course.
And indeed, we found it. Oh, yeah, we found tracks far beyond where Paul Freeman's tracks were.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So it had come, not as he had said, but it had come from the opposite direction, probably from the direction of this big drainage ditch, and came across the field, was on that little access road. I think it was heading right back up. If you went the direction it seemed to want to go, you would be right up over into the watershed, which is restricted access. And then on the other side of the watershed is the Wenatchee-Conan wilderness, just hundreds of square miles of wilderness area. And I think what happened is it got spooked. This, just as Paul realized this was the first time you were able to drive up on these secondary roads. Mm-hmm. I'm sure on a weekend there were probably people driving up into the foothills to have a bonfire, whatever. We're coming back in the wee hours of the morning. This thing probably saw the headlights, because right where the car had been parked was the point where the flexion point was, where it turned and started heading back. And then it was interesting because every second footprint, it was angled out 45 degrees. And I thought, what's going on here? Well, it wasn't until later that summer we took the family out to Oregon to visit friends, and we're on the beach. Got the kids building sandcastles. And then I thought, I'm going to go off and do some research. And I said, excuse myself. And I started watching the way people were walking and the footprints they were leaving. After a couple of dirty looks, I figured that's probably the best research method. Yeah. So I started watching my own footprints, and I was walking along, and about every second print or step or third step, I turned and would look back to see how my footprints looked. And I was trying walking to go. Every time I looked over my shoulder, my right foot angled out 45 degrees.
Oh.
And so that's what this creature was doing. It did a 180 turnabout, probably because the headlights are bouncing down the road, and then it took off walking and looking over its shoulder every few steps, and then it took off running. The car probably came around the bend, because then suddenly there's a big slide of the toes as they dig in, and the stride doubles. And you can just see where it ran for cover in the ditch, where there, was the only place. I mean, we're down in the foothills, not in the forest, but just outside of the forest, where they farm right up to the edge of the national forest boundary. Mm-hmm. And so I think this creature was down gleaning old fruit off of the plum orchards. There's these abandoned plum orchards down there, and in any case, whatever the case may be, it struck off across the plowed field towards the drainage ditch, which had brush, which had vegetation along it. I mean, you could read exactly what was going on, the behavior. Well, we quickly made some footprint casts, made a selection of about 7. I kick myself now because, there was still that little bit of tension of skepticism and enthusiasm and excitement, because had I really been 100% convinced, my brother obviously had to be back to work. I didn't have any absolute commitments. I could have just stayed. Should have had him drop me off at the nearest car rental and
Yeah.
2 days, because it's right. I mean, these were so fresh. I mean, these were so fresh that when I first knelt beside one, I could see skin ridge detail in that muddy, silty, that silt is so fine that when it's wet, I experimented with this in my backyard and where I actually raked out a flat area in the garden in the spring and actually when we got home and stepped out some prints. And, the first print in that moist clay loess, you could see every ridge detail on the sole of the foot and transferred to the footprint. In this, because there was kind of drizzly, rainy conditions, a lot of it had already been obliterated. And they, under those conditions, just gravity pulls those little details out very quickly. But there still were aspects where you could see the skin ridge detail as clear as could be. So they were extremely fresh. They had to, based on my experience, they had to have been less than 6 hours old.
Okay, I have so many questions. I'm getting chills listening to this story. Okay, so first of all, I'm a naturally excited person, so if I found tracks and I called my wife and said, "You're never gonna believe this," she would think that my brother and I went off drinking or something. So
yeah.
So how do you? I mean, who is the first person you call? I mean, you're with your brother, obviously. Who's the first person you call and say, "You're never gonna believe this"? Is it your wife?
Well, we didn't call back in those days.
Oh, hello, Corbin. I guess you didn't have cell phones.
Yeah, cell phone wasn't a thing. I didn't get a cell phone until years later. But
okay, yeah.
So, but that drive back to Boise, my brother and I, we just sat and, all the casts had been carefully wrapped in newspaper and put into sacks and carefully put them in the back of the pickup truck, and then, we talked. There were a lot of quiet moments as we were both reflecting on this, and we were talking a lot about what the implications would be. Of course, then we got home. I was so wired up, I couldn't go to bed. So while I stayed out in the garage and carefully unpacked each of these casts, and we had a sink in my dad's garage. There was a sink, so I was carefully washing the mud away and laying them out to dry, and just sitting there reflecting on this again. Because I cast 7 in total, and they showed we selected examples that showed the variation in appearance of the footprints depending on what was going on. So on the flat, they were a little more shallow. On the real wet mud, the wet silty substrate, toes were extended. There, like I said, there were examples where the toes were curled in, very sharply flexed. There were examples of half tracks where it was running. It was running up on the front half of the foot, but not on the ball of the foot, but with the foot flexed at the transverse tarsal joint, the mid-tarsal break. And so it wasn't until the next morning, I bring my dad out and show him, and because we've always had a little connection on the subject since he was with me there in Spokane at the showing of that film. I've asked him, since what he thought. And he goes, well, he says, what else could I think? I mean, there it was right in front of your eyes walking across the screen. I mean, he was quite impressed with it, just from his layman's point of view. Yeah, my wife at the time, she was always supportive. She, didn't have the same level of enthusiasm that I had, but of course, all my kids have since been very intrigued by it, so they were very interested in it at that point. But yeah, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that kind of trickle of. I've retold this story so many times. It's in the introductory chapter or introduction to my book, because it really was sort of the pivotal point, and convinced me all the more that the footprints. I mean, that's the testament that to there being a physical entity. Something's leaving these tracks, and we should be able to identify fake from real footprints or misidentified footprints, and that we have examples. Fortunately, fakery is pretty uncommon. There are a few glaring examples,
okay,
but they're usually also, until recently, very glaringly transparent. But some people have tried very hard to make something much more believable. I guess they've got nothing better to do. But I always wonder what the mind of the hoaxer But much more frequently are people who read too much into potential sign, either misidentified bear or just every pothole that has the general shape, or a little animal bounding in the snow leaves a series of imprints that melt out or get snowed over.
Yeah.
Looks like an alternating trackway. So misidentification.
That's a really good point, because, for instance, if you believe in ghosts or whatever, I don't know, or if you think your house is haunted, every crick and cranny see, it must be, you know what I mean? That must be the ghost. That's a good point that you actually came across, because I feel like if you're going out in the forest and you are looking for Sasquatch, I could imagine anything could be like, oh, wow, a Squatch was here, you know?
Oh, sure. Well, and there are, unfortunately, there are lots of people, and not for any ill intent, but they're just overly enthusiastic, and so they're I would call them the weekend warrior that have experiences on a weekly basis, and but when you press them for what constitutes those experiences, it's a bump in the night, it's an supposedly unusual tree structure, or a break, or something that they're attributing to Sasquatch. But yeah, I deal with people for whom every overturned stone, every rock on a stump, every nibbled on tree is sign of Bigfoot activity. And I try to emphasize to these people, one of the questions that's commonly asked is, how many of them do you think there are? And of course, there's questions about viable populations, about resource, so forth. I'm convinced that the number is much lower than a lot of people, even people who have given it some thought, have arrived at. In the entire North America, I would put the number probably in the range of 2,000 to 3,000. In the Pacific Northwest, just a couple of thousand. I mean, by that I mean Alaska, Western, everything west of the Mississippi, basically, Pacific and Intermountain West. They're just very rare. And I won't bore you with all the steps that I would go through to estimate or to infer a population, but just in our state of Idaho, if you look at the landforms, if you look at where there's sufficient rainfall to produce enough understory, well, a simple rule of thumb is, where are the black bear? Black bear is a large omnivore and need similar resources, not necessarily the exact same resources, because I think they're bears and a giant ape. They're able to process and digest, utilize resources differentially, so that there is that kind of niche partitioning in the omnivore niche. But look where in the state of Idaho bear are. Now, I would place the Sasquatch numbers in Idaho in the range of about 200, 250. There's 25,000 black bear. So there's 100 black bear for every one potential Sasquatch. Now, how much bear sign do you see on a regular basis, when you go out on a weekend hike? So these people who go out, and claim they're bumping into Sasquatch every single weekend, I sometimes say to someone like that, wow, that's amazing. Hey, this weekend, would you bring me back a picture of a black bear? Or even just a picture of a buck. Bring me a 5-point buck. There's probably 1,000 deer for every Sasquatch. And then it starts to sink in what I'm pointing to or getting at. What are the odds that you on a given weekend just bump into this extremely rare and intelligent and elusive animal?
I'm so happy you said that, because I grew up in Roby Creek, Idaho. So Roby Creek, my childhood. So I was in the forest. Bears were there. I've never seen a wild bear. That's a really good point. Like, we have a lot of bears here. I mean, unless you're actively. No, that's such a point. I mean, a lot of people don't see them. I mean, you'll have your problem ones occasionally, but you're right.
Sure. And people do see them, and we do have bones in the museum, and sure, and that's oftentimes that's turned back around on us. But my point is, these creatures are so rare. They're long-lived, so the turnover rate is much lower than even for a bear. I mean, these creatures, as large-bodied primates, large-bodied apes or hominins, probably have a life expectancy in the wild of anywhere from 40 to 50, maybe 60 years. Probably under 50 years. But a black bear is just 20 to 25 years usually. And so twice the turnover rate, that's twice as many bodies, but times 100 for the number of black bear, the ratio of black bear to Sasquatch. And then we start thinking about it. Large predatory animals do not, or when they die natural deaths usually, unless they're hit by a car or shot by a hunter. And so they secrete off somewhere, and they die, and their bodies are scattered by decomposers. And in dense coniferous forests, the soils are very acidic. In Idaho, they're actually volcanic, the batholiths, so that adds to the acidity of the soil. Bones just don't survive very long.
So because I was going to say, a skeptic would say, well, then why have we never found a dead specimen? And I'm sure you've heard that a million times, and I know.
Oh, yeah. And, it's a vexing, persistent question and problem. If someone walked in one day with a jaw of a Bigfoot, story, and that part, the discovery is made. And we wouldn't be having probably this conversation, at least not in the same way. I don't think even at that point it's suddenly going to be easy to come to understand what these creatures are. Studying them in the wild is still going to be as challenging as it was before, but there will be more people, more academics interested, certainly, more grant money may be available to finance sustained ongoing field exploration and research. I tend to run into what's more vexing is people who throw up those kinds of questions, but are completely unwilling to consider the footprint evidence, the hair. It's like I had a department chairman, a past chairman, who said to me, he said, well, they're just stories, Jeff. Well, just stories that leave footprints, that shed hair, that void scat, that vocalize, that are witnessed by credible witnesses under sometimes very good conditions, that feature prominently in the Native American traditions and contemporary reports, of these people, these indigenous populations that have been here much longer than we have. And so it's not just stories. If it were just stories, then I wouldn't be justified as a physical anthropologist pursuing this question. It would be the realm of cultural anthropology, or sociology, psychology, those kinds of disciplines. But the fact that we have trace and physical evidence, we have footprints that are consistent and biomechanically appropriate and sound for the type of creature described in the habitat and moving the way it's described to move. We have hair that defies attribution to common forms of wildlife or domestic animals, but that is primate hair, not fur.
Oh, okay. It is primate hair. Okay.
It's primate hair. All the other animals, the potential hair-bearing animals out there, typically have fur with guard hairs and under fur.
Yeah.
And so when I see a sample where there's differentiation into those two types, it's immediately ruled out. But when we get hair that essentially hardly can be differentiated from your own head hair or body hair, we have sort of a modified type of guard hair, and then we don't have under fur, and then of course our head hair is very modified, but and differentiated. But they look like human hair, except they've never had a haircut. And there are other aspects, consistent absence of a cellular medulla, other aspects about the follicle that seem to be a little bit different, but we got to get DNA. That's one of the big pushes and one of the things I'm very excited about, just to maybe take us in a different vein, is the potential now of environmental DNA. We've gotten all kinds of publicity. For example, Neil Gemmell from New Zealand has led a study, and we're still waiting for the final results, but they've analyzed water samples from Loch Ness to determine if there's some unexpected species amongst this sample taken there. And so I've raised questions about our past approaches and apparent shortfalls in attempting to get DNA from samples, whether we're maybe getting what I would call false negatives, that is DNA from hair samples that's identified as human, but only on the basis of looking maybe at one mitochondrial gene. And I've talked to a number of geneticists who do this kind of thing. They say, oh, no, you need at least the entire mitochondrial genome and a half dozen or a dozen nuclear genes to boot in order to confidently differentiate such potentially closely affiliated species. And so I've gotten Dr. Gemmell's interest And so our big push this year is going to be to undertake some eDNA analyses of some soil samples taken from potential nest sites, for example.
Nest sites?
Yeah, because that was the thing. The question is, if you're going to take a soil sample, where do you take it?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Is as rare. Well, if you've got a nest that looks like a gorilla nest in the Olympic rainforest of Washington, it's not like a bear nest where they just scrape detritus stuff into a pile and sleep on top of it for insulation. This thing was constructed. It has a lot. There were several of them actually in a cluster. Had sort of an undercarriage of branches, broomsticks dimension, inch diameter branches, with duff and litter piled on top, heaped on top, and then they had meticulously snapped off all of the upper 6 inches, the 6-inch sprigs on these evergreen huckleberries at a height which grow up to a height of about 8 feet. They'd reached up in about 6.5, 7 feet, had snapped these off, and then not just piled them, but had stuck them in and woven them into a nest like a bird, like a big giant bird nest.
Oh, wow.
It's just really stunning. As far as background for these nests, a timber cruiser was marking out a section for harvest. This was behind locked gates, literally 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the nearest road. And he stumbled on these nests, which, like I said, the only other potential candidate would be a bear making such a thing. And yet was unlike any bear nest he'd ever seen, unlike any that I've ever seen. And in fact, they brought one of the, he identified a couple of investigators there in the region, some Bigfoot investigators. And the Olympic Project is their group. And they came down, as the thought occurred to him, I wonder if this is Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And they examined it, were impressed. They arranged and had a couple of bear biologists visit the site.
Okay.
Said, no, this isn't bear. I mean, something with hands snapped those branches off. They're not chewed off or anything. And the interweaving, it would require manipulation, dexterity. There were about 5 or 6 nests and one small nest up a couple feet off the ground, sort of in the crook of a bush. When I first saw that, I couldn't help but think, that looks like a bassinet. Huh. And so, because my mind was already wondering why in the world, because there have been such nests on rare occasion attributed to Sasquatch in the past. There have often been questions of whether they were misidentified bear beds, as they sometimes call them. But why would there be these at this site at this time, and then but not? Why aren't we finding them on a regular basis? I mean, obviously they're not building nests to sleep in every night. Otherwise, they would be all over the place. So what was the occasion? And then when I saw that little nest, I wondered maybe this was a birthing event. Birthings for a large ape are spaced considerably. Orangutans may give birth only, 4 or 5 times in their lifetime, and there's anywhere from 4 to 6 years between births. So they're not happening all the time. And again, if they're very rare and they're spaced out, maybe some of these had come together for this blessed event, and all the aunties were midwifing, and
oh my God!
But who knows? I mean, I'm just imagining what. But it's a conceivable scenario, and the location was really quite amazing because it's right on the edge of a rather precipitous drop off, about 300-foot, very steep incline down to the little stream below, which was rich with, at that time of year, was rich with steelhead and salmon coming upstream. And then this huge hedgerow of evergreen huckleberries that would, at that time of year, would have been heavy laden with fruits. So there was a lot of resources immediately available, and very protected. Not much, virtually no human traffic, with the exception of this timber cruiser, since it was private land with locked gates. Just once in a blue moon, there would be a hunter back in there with permission. So it's fascinating. Anyway, when I was discussing with colleagues the possible applications of eDNA, and one of them said, well, but the devil's in the details, and the detail is, where do you take the sample?
Yeah.
Well, I had just come from visiting this site, and I go, I know exactly where we should sample. And so we did that. We took some core samples, just literally took, a sterile tube, and cored the central detritus of the nest. And the thing that was so exciting is, in the past, when we tried to do DNA analysis of hair, for example, one of the consistent characteristics I mentioned was the lack of a cellular medulla, that central core of the hair shaft, that dark band you see under the microscope. That's where the dead accumulated cells are. The cortex is all keratin, just extracellular protein, as is the cuticle. And so in the absence of that medulla, there's precious little DNA material in that hair shaft. And most hairs that are shed, they're lost because the follicle periodically goes through a period of quiescence, and it shrinks up, and the cells die off, and the hair just slips out of the follicle, and the root out of the follicle. And so more often than not, when we have very promising looking hair based on morphology tested for DNA, there is no DNA, or if DNA is detected, it's identified as human and attributed either to the handling of the hair sample by the witnesses, or a misidentified human hair that's been shed and collected. Well, the third possibility is, as I mentioned, this false negative. Maybe it's not a human at all, but they've looked at such a small, little, teeny piece of DNA. It's like looking at the ball game through the pinhole or the knot hole in the fence. They don't have enough information to make the distinction between human and a very closely related species, maybe even, like I said, an early hominin that would be much more closely related to us than a chimpanzee, which has a very high percentage, depending on which number you settle on, 96 to 98% or 99% identity. Sasquatch may be 99.5 or 99.7% identical to human.
Why do you think they have stayed hidden for all these years? I mean, first of all, what was the first sighting, like the first account of, does it date back to the Native Americans? Because some people on Facebook were saying that. I mean, when was the first record of a Sasquatch?
Well, as you suggest, the Native American traditions and stories and traditional knowledge, I think is the best way to label that, includes depictions of the wild man of the woods or the wild woman of the woods that go back to their earliest oral traditions. In their estimation, they've always been here. In fact, in some, Kathy Strain is an archaeologist for the Forest Service who's very interested in the subject, written a fantastic book, an accumulation, an anthology of Native American traditional stories about giants, cannibals, and ogres. And the Yokuts, she's drawn attention to a particular interesting pictograph created by the Yokuts in California, which attribute their origin story to the hairy man. It was the hairy man that fashioned humans in his image, essentially, to stand upright in contrast to all the other forest creatures like he does. But when the humans saw this gigantic hair-covered entity, they were afraid and ran away. And so the depiction of the hairy man shows tears running down his cheeks, and he vows only to stalk the forest at night so that he won't frighten these little people that he's created. And it explains not only supposedly our origin relationships, but it explains some of the behavior attributed to Sasquatch. So those go way back. The first real public announcement, I guess, if you will, in the popular press was 1958, at least in the United States. 1958, when Jerry Crew came into town with a plaster cast of a footprint that was photographed, and AP Wire Services picked it up and ran with it, and Bigfoot was born in 1958. The term Bigfoot, I should say.
Okay.
But the point being, though, that these stories amongst the loggers and foresters and prospectors went back decades. I mean, the legend of Mount St. Helens and the miners that were apparently accosted by these mountain devils, these giant apes, that goes back to the 1920s. So, and of course, there's other stories. If you go back into the papers of the eastern states, there's all kinds of wild man stories from back there, and what exactly the relationship is, if those are actually Sasquatch encounters. Or, I mean, they didn't have the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot back in the Midwestern states in the late 1800s, but they did know about wild men because of the long-standing traditions in Europe from the 11th to the 12th, 13th century, where wild men were on heraldic crests, and the wild men carved into the cathedrals and so forth. And
really, I actually have some. I have some family ancestry I would like to share with you. Are you ready for this? That I just found out yesterday. Apparently, my uncle Craig messaged me yesterday. Apparently, my Grandpa Maxey, did a Sasquatch investigation in Missouri, where my family's from, in the 1970s.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. So apparently, I have roots in this in this Sasquatch, but. So he mentioned something, Craig mentioned something, and I've heard this numerous times from people who have seen Sasquatch. He explained that he had an encounter, and a lot of people say they have a smell to them. Can you go into that?
Sure.
Yeah. What are the characteristics of a Sasquatch sighting?
The scent is often described as kind of a locker room, a very musky, dirty gym clothes, dirty gym socks, putrid, maybe rancid meat kind of a smell. In fact, down in Florida, that smell is what gave the local rendition of Bigfoot its name, the skunk ape. But if you look at the statistics, I mean, in terms of John Green, I mentioned earlier at the beginning, he went through meticulously by hand initially, and later with some computer algorithms, and tallied up some aspects of reports of encounters, and he found that a mention of a noticeable smell only occurred in about 10% of the reported encounters. So that raises the question: do they always smell like that, or not? So, like in my book, I talk about how great apes, as do humans, have these well-developed apocrine sweat glands, not the watery, evaporative sweat like when you're out working out in the gym, but the sweat you get when you're going up to talk to the boss or stand in front of the audience at the podium, which gives a much greater odor. I point out when Diane Fossey, who studied the gorillas, described her first bluff charge, she said this silverback came barreling down towards her. She adopted a very submissive posture, just ready to take her knocks there, and it stopped, she said, just feet short of her. But she said the overpowering odor that it emitted nearly knocked her over. And so under stress and agitation, these apes also can exude this very pungent, musky smell. And I think that's what people are describing. When a Sasquatch is agitated, it's frightened, or it's threatening, then it probably exudes that odor on those occasions. But on other times, if you've ever been around great apes, I've had the privilege of being up close. I mean, they have that animal smell, like any. They don't bathe daily and powder and spray and don perfumes and colognes and whatnot. So they've got that smell, but it's not an off-putting smell. But if they really get, just human body odor. I mean, human body odor we find very distasteful, and that's why we have such social norms of hygiene and bathing occasionally and so forth.
So what do you think their habits are? So I didn't realize this. I guess I never even thought of this. So do you think they're more of a nocturnal creature, solitary, I'm assuming? Can we go into that really quick?
Almost all the footprint finds, most of the encounters are of solitary individuals, single individuals, the credible ones. it's tempting to kind of to analogize to the orangutan, which of the great apes is also semi-solitary and has what we call a noyu. A male defends not a harem of females, but he defends a territory that includes the territories of other females with their dependent offspring. And he defends that from interloping, upstart males. Mm-hmm. And the females, when they're ready, when they're receptive, they seek out the male and his company and attentions, not the other way around. Usually, I mean, it's the young adult males that are with hormones raging that are responsible for accosting females when they are not receptive otherwise. So anyway, nocturnality, diurnality. Again, going back to John Green and his statistics, he noted that half of the reports in his files were at night, but half were in the daytime. And so he argued that given the limited field of vision of humans at night and the limited scope of our activities at night, to have that many encounters would suggest that they're much more active at night than they are in the daytime, but not exclusively. So, a lot of people think that the only time you can do legitimate Bigfoot research to actually have an encounter is at night. And yet many of the sightings are in broad daylight. Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin bumped into Patty on Bluff Creek in 1967 in the early afternoon in broad daylight.
Yeah.
So,
and I have to actually talk to you about that. And for those of you wondering, if you're not a hardcore Bigfoot or Sasquatch enthusiast, we're referring to the film, the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film shot in Northern California. It came out years ago. It was a hoax, and then some people say it wasn't. What are your thoughts on that film?
Well, I'm quite convinced. I'm as convinced as I can be, short of having stood there on the sandbar myself, that that's the real deal. I mean, based on, if I had nothing but the footprint record from that site, I would be convinced that it was authentic. But add to that the remarkable anatomy and the locomotion. I mean, I can see the signs of animation in the footprints and infer it from the footprints, but I don't have to stop there because I can watch the actual kinematics of the bipedalism of that creature on the film, and they agree. I mean, its movement agrees with what the footprint record documents, but all the other anatomy, the aspects are so persuasive that there's just no way. I mean, all you have to do is go back in 1967 and see what was available to Patterson at the time. I had to laugh on a documentary. The producers showed the film to a costume designer in Hollywood. And he's watching it and he says, "Oh, well, it's obviously a man in a fursuit. And here's how we do it." And then the camera pans over and here's an actor donning a costume. And he's pulling on this spandex undergarment with sewn-in, sculpted foam rubber musculature. And then he pulls on this four-way stretch for two-piece outfit with, two body pieces, separate hands and gloves, and of course the masks. But the whole thing has 6 to 8 inch fur to cover up all the joints at the waist, wrists, and which Patty didn't have. She had very short hair and sparse hair. Well, wait a minute. Let's back up. In 1967, they didn't have spandex. Foam rubber was just being experimented with in Hollywood. John Chambers was making costumes at that very time for the first Planet of the Apes movie. And he got an Oscar or a nomination for an Oscar, I can't remember which now, for his pioneering techniques of creating these injected foam rubber appliances that they used for the mouth and the eyebrows and the ears of the actors in the Planet of the Apes movie. They didn't have four-way stretch fur. They had fur cloth, which is what they used on Planet of the Apes. If you remember in one of the later movies, the sauna scene when apes are in there with just the towel, and they look like big, hairy Pillsbury Doughboys. I mean, there's no anatomy. It's just, and that's, through much of the rest of the movie, they're wearing high-necked leather tunics that come clear down to the wrist and all the way down to their ankles. there wasn't the material, let alone the wherewithal, let alone the understanding of anatomy and anthropology. So 2017 was the 50th anniversary, looking back 50 years with 50 years hindsight. And there are so many things about that film that anticipate what we now know in anthropology. For example, just to illustrate, it's a great one. John Napier, who was actually a rather sympathetic scientist towards the question, and actually wrote an excellent book for the time. He was a renowned primatologist and one of the fathers of modern primate locomotion studies. Anyway, his book came out in the early 70s, so he had a few years to consider some of the evidence that accumulated since the Patterson-Gimlin film. He could not accept that the Patterson-Gimlin film was authentic, but he couldn't quite put his finger on any one thing. And then he offered a possible contradiction. He said, from the waist up, it looks essentially like an ape, but from the waist down, it looks typically human. It's inconceivable, he said, for such a hybrid or such a mosaic, or hybrid, I think was the word he used, such a hybrid of structure to exist in nature. One or the other half has to be fake, or therefore the entire thing is fake. Well, interestingly, just a few years after his book was published, the discovery of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, with a much more extensive skeleton of these early Australopithecines. And how did they describe it in the press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a short-legged human. Isn't it curious how evolution of hominins has progressed in this mosaic fashion with unexpected combinations of traits? Well, now, wait a minute. That was the very basis for rejecting the Patterson-Gimlin film just 5 years earlier. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Napier hadn't published his book for another decade. What would he have thought about the Patterson-Gimlin film then? You know, no one really followed up with that. And there's example after example, looking at the adaptations of the facial skeleton and proportion, that flat face and deep jaws and evidence of huge chewing muscles, the lack of projecting canines in the absence of the use of tools.
Yeah.
And on and on. The foot, the non-divergent big toe combined with the flexible instep, which colleagues of mine have argued about until now. We know that our early hominin ancestors walked on a flat, flexible foot with a non-divergent big toe, just like I've been arguing for them as well as for Sasquatch for decades, and now it's finally getting some traction.
I remember in the press a few years ago, someone from the film came out and said, oh, it was an ape costume. Like, I don't know, someone from the family. Can you go into that?
Sure. I mean, the main story came from a fellow named Bob Hieronymus, who had some interactions with Roger Patterson back then, and he claimed to be the man in the fursuit. And if you want the whole story, it's Greg Long has a book, which is a very revealing book in the remarkable inconsistencies in the stories and allegations. He said, she said. Hieronymus described a costume, and yet that costume was supposed to have been supplied by a man named Philip Morris, a costume maker from back east, who said he looked at the film and recognized that was one of his costumes. He must not have been wearing his glasses at the time, because anybody can look at it. It's not nothing like it. But the description of his costume, the features of his costume, were totally different from what Bob Hieronymus claims. Hieronymus claims it was a green horsehide that was created to make the appearance, and that it was, it was so stiff he needed help to get his arms through, and that he had a head that was built up around a football helmet. Bob Hieronymus has one glass eye, so he has just one good eye, and he said that the opening for the eye was about 2 inches away from his eye. All right, now you think, go take a toilet paper roll, empty roll, and stick it up to your eye, close the other eye, and then go walk across a similar kind of sandbar strewn with irregular surface and dead wood from the flood that had come through. And you watch Patty. Not once does she look down at the ground at her feet. She's walking like a normal, very natural, fluidly moving animal that's quite at home in that environment, with that high stepping gait to allow her to negotiate the irregular surface and so forth, especially once she gets off that unobstructed sandbar, relatively unobstructed sandbar, up into the woods. I mean, there's so many holes that are gaping. You don't even have to actively punch them. They're already there. So no, all of those claims and allegations just fall absolutely flat.
Do you think the other Sasquatches looked at Patty and said, "Damn it, Patty, we've done it for so many years, and you just had to go out and walk on that sandbar"?
Oh, yeah, I wonder that sometimes. It was such a fluky set of circumstances, and yet, it set the bar so high for the quality of imagery that we expect. And, in this day and age of cell phones, of iPhones, people ask, well, why don't you have more pictures? Well, actually, there are a lot. They're not great because most people are not good photographers first, and they don't expect the situation. It's like I said, these people who go out intending to run into Bigfoot, they're not experiencing anything but mostly their own imagination. And I don't mean to make a blanket statement on that. Maybe that's not fair, but take most people who are probably not too different from me. My cell phone is in my pocket, my iPhone. I've actually only had an iPhone for a short time, and still getting my iPhone out and pushing the proper sequence of buttons and not having my finger get in the way of the lens and snapping off a picture. I mean, most encounters that are serendipitous are very brief, just a matter of seconds. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't surprise me that there aren't very many good pictures out there. There's some titillating ones, a few here and there, besides the Patterson-Gimlin film. In my book, I talk about the Freeman footage, which I still think is a pretty darn good one, and the Memorial Day footage, which was covered in the documentary and hence was covered again. But I did have the opportunity to go to the site of that one and spend time with the witnesses. It's a very different experience when you can, it's one thing to sit in your office or in your armchair and scrutinize and do the kind of analysis of the actual video. But when, in addition to that, you have the chance to go to the site and walk the trail, explore the surroundings and the context, talk to the witnesses, sit and speak with them. I had sat and had lunch with the Pates on that occasion, and conversation goes here and there, and it isn't focused just about their experience, and you get to know them, their motivations, their background, their personality and demeanor. I think that was a very interesting piece of footage as well.
Man, okay, so I know you have to go soon. Can we answer a few Facebook questions? Because I promised my followers. Okay, are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So our first one, and a lot of people asked about bones. I think you kind of covered the bones. We had Donald asked why have bones never been found? Is that just because you said the acidity in the soil? Yes,
the acidity, the environment, the abiotic and the biotic. There are porcupines, rodents, squirrels, you name it, that chew up bone very, very, very quickly in the wild. You think about the number of deer. A friend of mine was from Great Lakes area, I think it was from Minnesota's, but he talked to their DNR, their Division of Natural Resources, and there's an estimate of 10,000 deer that die of winter kill. Where are those bodies and bones? When you go out hiking, we're not up to our ankles in deer carcasses. There, if you stumble upon just a few vertebrae or partial skull or something of a deer on a hike, that's pretty typical, but not common even. Again, you take into the equation 1,000 deer for every one Sasquatch out there, and deer dying every 12, 15 years. I'm not sure what the life expectancy. I haven't really looked at that. It's a good question. All those things, I think, the big thing that, again, the big contrast between deer and a Sasquatch, top predator prey. Top predators you rarely find. Ask outdoorsmen, how many lynx, how many wolverine skeletons or skulls have you found? Talk about numbers of rare animals here in Idaho. Well, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, there's only about 300 wolverines. It's just the numbers are really, really low. If even that doesn't even ring right. It's lower than that, off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And wait, you said something. Wait, okay. And then another person, Andy asked, "Do you think that Sasquatch is a herbivore or a carnivore? Do you think they're more of an omnivore? Like, what do you think the diet is? Omnivore."
I think omnivore, because they exhibit the morphology of a more omnivorous kind of a diet. Animals that have the depth of jaw that they have typically have big teeth with more bunodont, more rounded cusps. The sightings, those encounters where the observer has noted the presence or absence of canines, almost invariably have no projecting canine teeth. The canines are short and probably wear end to end, which what that means is they're capable of this second phase of the chewing cycle, this grinding phase. Whereas when you have gaping canines, you have more or less just an open and close. The first phase dominates. And, if you look at gorillas, for example, they have very high crested molars where they slice up that vegetation. I don't think these teeth would, although I've not peered into a Sasquatch mouth, the correlation of the kind of teeth that I'm suggesting with the dimensions and proportions and flat face with post-canine loading emphasized, those correlations are really quite good. And so the animals that have all those external proportions, like Gigantopithecus, like Paranthropus, especially Paranthropus, great mollusks, we have so much more of its craniofacial anatomy. They're omnivorous in their diet as well. But we have, but I was going to say also then eyewitness accounts. We have eyewitnesses talking about everything from roots and berries right on up to them taking deer and elk.
Really?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I've never heard of the deer and elk. I always thought they were a peaceful gorilla type creature eating the berries and.
Well, more like a chimpanzee.
Okay, which are yeah.
The hunting behaviors of chimpanzee with other monkeys, with impala, baboons and impala, but even chimps sometimes occasionally come upon, and human babies. And that was another interesting aspect too, is that the Native Americans have these stories which many just dismiss as boogeyman stories of the Zonaqua that snatches naughty children and takes them home to eat them, and they usually get away. But a just so story? Well, maybe not, because there are documented cases where chimpanzees have snatched human children and eaten them. In fact, there was a rash during a very protracted drought in Uganda over one particular year, about a 7-month stretch. There were 12 cases of human infants and toddlers snatched by chimpanzees, and in some cases dispatched and partially consumed before they could be retrieved. So again, not to dwell on the macabre, but it's just amazing that here something that we might be quick to just dismiss as a just so story may actually have basis, certainly has precedent in the natural history and behavior of other known great apes. So what an interesting connection or correlation there.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Lori wants to know if the sightings of them may simply be adolescents that have not mastered the art of camouflage that the adults have. Could you please ask Jeff? Please, 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 Lori.
Well, that's a possibility. One of the offered explanations for sightings of Sasquatch in kind of out of the way odd places, like out in the sagebrush steppe of Idaho or something. If this model of their social structure is correct, then when the young dependent juveniles, especially the males, come into their own, their presence won't be tolerated by the resident dominant male, and they'll be driven out. And so they have to strike out to find their own territory, or to bide their time until they can bulk up enough that they can challenge a dominant male and usurp his territory. So dispersing what Grover called rogue males might explain some of those. I mean, I think we can kind of differentiate. If the eyewitnesses encounter is sufficient that they can estimate size, we can differentiate between, what might be juveniles versus what might be adult. But it may be that less experienced juveniles are more prone to risk-taking and approaching human habitations to investigate or to pilfer or to whatever. And so, that might account for more of the in-close encounters, whereas the males, the dominant males that have the prime territories, which are away and removed, or the females that have offspring that don't dare take those risks because they don't want to expose their offspring to the potential risks of human contact.
Okay.
Maybe less seen. Okay. I mean, Patty, take Patty's example. That used to be, until that road was put in, was a very remote area. That part of Northern California, I mean, you might as well have been on the dark side of the moon until roads began to go in and the logging really started taking hold in there. I mean, even now, there are vast stretches there that, there are a few roads, paved roads, but it still doesn't take you very long to get completely away from civilization and out of touch with things. So, she was in an out-of-the-way spot when she was encountered.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A lot of people on Facebook have asked, what are your thoughts about the Bigfoot shows? And I know that you were on Finding Bigfoot. So what are your thoughts? They're in their 12th season. They've never seen a Bigfoot. It's like ratings gold for Animal Planet.
No, that's true. It really was. It was Animal Planet's bread and butter there. And that's why one of the reasons they did not diverge from their rather stilted formula. It is done. It's not. I mean, there may be reruns now, but it's done, and it's going to be interesting to see. There's kind of a scramble going on as to who's going to fill that niche with what, and it's always been a double-edged sword in a way, and it's gotten better with time. Initially, it was always kind of a risky business because obviously I have no creative control nor any editorial control. And so it's very easy for my statements to be taken out of context or for the show to take a completely different turn than what had initially been described when we were exploring the possibility of my participation. And that's happened a couple of times. But for all those potential pitfalls, there have been so many advantages. I mean, I got to go to, Monster Quest. Let me say Monster Quest was head and shoulders above Finding Bigfoot, I think, as far as an educational and expository type of a documentary. And it provided me a chance to go to some really great places, to go to China and examine footprints that were remarkable, were absolutely compelling, and to see other types of evidence firsthand, to visit with witnesses, to see locations firsthand. So I've been very grateful for the opportunity to participate. You just have to be careful about what you say. You realize you're never off the record, or off camera. Everything is always fair game and might be edited. You can't qualify a statement with a preface because that can easily be edited away. So you have to say things that are soundbite quality and succinct. Yeah. I mean, I don't regret. I regret some circumstances, but I don't regret having participated. And I think that's what I wanted to add was it's just the opportunity. I mean, if they weren't talking to me, who would they be talking to? Mm-hmm. So it gives me an opportunity as that kind of lone voice from the scientific community, keeping that door ajar and keeping it relatively grounded in at least one voice that's grounded and sometimes a little less emotional and more rational than others might be. So I think that has been a great opportunity as well.
Great. Okay, one last Facebook question. Elizabeth wants to know, what was the most recent Sasquatch sighting?
Yeah, that's a question I'm not prepared for. Honestly, I don't keep my finger on that pulse so much unless there's really good corroborating evidence with it. I mean, footprints. I really want to see the footprints, because it's to the point now where it's very. I mean, I've learned even with footprints, I cannot accept a witness's testimony on face. I have to see the footprints and evaluate them myself. With that realization, when it comes to eyewitness testimony, unless it's someone whose reputation, is and expertise set them apart, I just can't accept a verbal, a verbal account of an encounter only carries so much weight by itself. We're back to my department chairman. Well, after all, Jeff, they're just stories. So an uncorroborated account is just a story. Unless there's another layer or two that's provided by that person. In other words, if a wildlife biologist is out on a biodiversity survey and reports having a visual encounter, well, that carries a lot more weight than, well, I got to be careful what I choose here.
Susie.
Just Joe Blow. Just whoever. A working man out for a weekend drive, or a hunter, or someone who spends a lot of time and sees something that's not a bear. He's hunting for bear and he sees something that's not a bear. Because that's one of the most common, quote, lookalikes, is the 5-digit imprint of a bear hind paw or a bear standing upright.
I like how you are skeptical. I mean, I really do. Like, I mean, as a scientist, you should be. I mean, that's what we, I really appreciate that.
Yeah. It's got to be part of the formula. It's the ideological skeptics who doubt everything and who just pound that one key on the keyboard over and over. If that key is part of a melody, it plays an important role. Skepticism and objectivity. But, the big advances, the big discoveries in science aren't necessarily made by the skeptics who sit at home poking holes in everything that comes by them, mm-hmm. Trying to poke holes. Or it's in some instances in this field, there's a fine line between the ideological skeptics and the trolls that are out there.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff, I know you have to go. I have one last question. This is my question. Are you ready for it?
I am.
What would you do if you saw Sasquatch?
Well, I'd try to keep as much composure and observe as carefully. If I had the wherewithal to document it, and then follow up with, trying to cut the sign, see if there's any footprints, or, when you have a 800-pound gorilla going through the forest, they've got to leave some trace. And so if you hopefully have the wherewithal to document that, just document it.
Would you be a little nervous? Like, I would be terrified.
Oh.
I would be like, my God. Like, I would put my head down to show I'm not, like, trying to, like what you do with a gorilla. I'd be like, I'm Jeff. I believe.
Yeah. Right. Oh, well, I guess it depends on the circumstances. I mean, with the flash of a scenario that came to mind when you said that was, as so often is the case, just a brief glimpse and then a fleeting backside as it disappears into the tree line. If you had the opportunity for that closer type of interaction. No, I think at this point, I've thought about that so much, and intellectually, it's just like when I'm out in the woods, whether I'm alone and I usually don't for safety purposes, because we go traipsing off trail and off road quite some distance, but only done that once and realized it was a great experience to do it solo, but it's not a very prudent approach to field work. But you have to intellectualize. I mean, we all naturally have that instinct for self-preservation and that kind of self-serving fear that comes up. But at one point, one of the first expeditions that I was on, where we were out in Northern California for over a month, I quickly realized that I'm going to go crazy if I let this get to me like this, because there's and why am I here? Well, I'm here to have just that encounter that I'm subliminally or subconsciously fearful of. So instead of being afraid that there's a Bigfoot behind every tree, I should hope that there's a Bigfoot behind every tree, and I should be looking behind every tree. And that, when that process, and it didn't happen just like that. It wasn't like snap fingers. You still have to master yourself. But it really changed my experience. And from then on, I was always cautious. I'm more afraid of bumping into a black bear at night or parting the willows along a stream and seeing a sow bear with her cubs, quarters. And for that reason, we carry bear spray and, pepper spray. And I typically have at least pepper spray and perhaps also a sidearm. But it's for that purpose alone. And
I know this sounds like a ridiculous question, but have you ever seen Sasquatch, or is the only evidence the footprints? Have you ever seen Sasquatch?
So I did have an experience where, I've had, as far as actually seen, I've been up close, I think, because of what was happening in camp and disturbance to our tents and so forth. But just this past year, last fall, or the fall before, so time starts to fly. Anyway, I was up in Alberta, Canada, with a fellow named Todd Standing, who himself is a rather controversial figure. So we won't get into all that controversy at this point. But at his invitation, was up there, as well as Dr. John Bindernagel, the late Dr. John Bindernagel. And we had something approach camp one night, wee hours in the morning, about 1:30 in the morning. We'd stay up very late, hoping that our the sounds and activities around the campfire and smells of food, throw a strip of bacon on the coals and would lure things in. And something did. And we had heard vocalizations, heard brush popping. We heard massive brush popping. I mean, it sounded like a bull moose was making its way around our camp just outside of the firelight. And one of the members of our team approached, talking to it reassuringly, trying to coax it, in closer or whatever. And it was reacting by breaking branches. And at one point, it broke. It sounded like it cracked a Louisville Slugger across the tree trunk. And I'm watching through night vision. It affected her, and her knees started to shake. And she backed away and came back into the firelight. I mean, she was quite gutsy, walking right out into the darkness. And
so you actually saw that? You saw a figure?
Well, at that point, I stood up because the smoke was blowing in my face with my night vision. We were camped up against a berm, and so my view of where the sounds were emanating was slightly obscured. But from that dark, shadowy gully right down beyond the berm, something stepped out and walked across the road. And if you imagine Patty, but jet black in silhouette against the light gravel, the granite of that road, just kind of illuminated by the ambient starlight, it wasn't much light. So my night vision's good. It was a third generation night vision, but still, because of the low light, was rather speckly. And so I was questioning myself what I saw, and I kept pulling the lens away from my eye and moving it back and forth to see if I could get a shadow to appear. I couldn't. Whatever it looked like, hedged low on the broad shoulders, the arms swinging, I could only see it from about mid-thigh up. And it just very smoothly went up slope and into the trees on the opposite side. And they cut sign. I had to leave the next day before sunup, but Dr. Bindernagel and Todd cut sign and found impressions and broken vegetation, flagged it out where it looked like it had walked. And then Todd stood back where I had been standing, and John walked that tape. And when I saw the video, that was it. At first I thought they were in the wrong place. I thought it was much closer, but it was actually over there. But it was 1.5 feet taller than John from that vantage point. So it was about 7.5 feet tall, which kind of agrees. We were finding 13.5 inch footprints in the moss. And so it could well have been this creature just checking us out that night and didn't like what we were doing, I guess, and was trying to intimidate us. This could have been one of those juveniles that one of your callers was suggesting. A 13-inch footprint. It may not have been a full adult male, but he was blustering and trying to intimidate us with all of the branch breaking and so forth.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you so much. I've done a lot of these podcast interviews, but I don't think I've ever been more. I mean, like, I've heard a story where my hair's rising on my, my arms, and I want to go out and look for Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Yeah. Would you take me?
Oh, sure.
You just hesitated.
It's an exciting experience. It puts a whole new dimension of being on, to being in the woods, and you're much more observant, I think, when you're keyed into any kind of signs or sound, and much more aware of your environment that way.
Perfect. And your book, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, is available online, Amazon. People can go pick it up.
That's correct.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You bet. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Animals to the Max podcast. Please make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps me out. I also encourage you to check out CorbinMaxey.com. You can contact me there personally, even suggest a podcast guest, or if you just want to learn more about animals.